Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread where we discuss the weekly Torah portion. This week's Parashat is Parashat Shoftim, and that is the fifth Parashat of the book of Devarim, also called Deuteronomy. And Shoftim means judges. I'm going to be sharing a message with you called Guard the Gates, which I wrote in 2005-6. For this parashat, so I'm going back and recording on video some of my previous messages. That way people can have a little catalog of messages. I do a new message every year for each parashat. So anyway, this is my 2005-6 message called Guard the Gate. Now, we'll start off with the key verse that we start off with in this parashat is Deuteronomy 16:18. And it says, "Judges and officers shall you make in all your gates, which Yahweh your Elohim gives you throughout your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment." So that's where I'm building off of that verse about guarding the gates. That's also the verse where we get the parashat name Shoftim for judges, just judges in all your gates. So we'll start off with the definition of gate, which is the Hebrew word sha'ar. It means opening door or gate. And in the Hebrew, that's spelled shin, ayin, resh. And in the ancient Hebrew, that could mean where each of the letters or pictographs have a meaning. That could mean test, eye, head. Now, a lot of times, when you look at that, you say, well, how does that translate to the concept of sha'ar, the gate? And what we see is that the test eye head, or it could be test eye in the beginning, resh can mean beginning or head. How I see that being connected to this concept of sha'ar or the gate is this concept that people have heard the saying that the eyes are the window to the soul, and there's probably a bit of truth to that. The eye in the scriptures is spoken about in many places, and it's used in many places. So when we see observation, the eye is for most people the key way that they observe. We like the old saying, I'll believe it when I see it, is we put a lot of weight on what we see with our eyes. And yet our eyes really are one witness. There's other witnesses and gates that we have, but this is one that brings in information. And at the gate, just like any city gate, it has two purposes. It lets things in and it lets things out. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to see what this concept of the shin, ain, resh, test, eye, head, means. And I think that what it does is it means that this is this gate, this testing through the eyes of the head of what this is this gate to determine in our heads what we see. And this is part of a test, is to rightly see or observe or understand what it is that we're seeing. This is this concept of gate, where the just judges must be in all your gates. In other words, you, just like eating kosher, must have judgment upon what you put in your mouth. You, when it says every idle word will come into judgment, must have judgment in what goes out of your mouth. When Israel's commanded to shamar, to hear, you can, as Mashiach said, become dull of hearing, where you're not listening, you're not hearing what's being said. You can close your eyes and create your own personal blindness. We get this model with our eyelids, which is interesting because there's natural blindness, and then there's the fact that we can simply close our eyes and choose to blind ourselves or to shut off that form of observation. Now, and there's some things that's good for. Some things it's bad for. It's bad to close your eyes to the truth. It's good to close your eyes to wickedness in certain cases that you shouldn't look upon. So we see this concept of this gate, and we start off there because this concept of this parashat in Deuteronomy 16:18 is guarding the gates. So we look first at what the gates are. Now that we've seen the mechanic of how the gates work and what kind of gates we have, we have to understand this duality, this concept of the inside and the outside. Just as our mouth is a gate that stops things from coming in or from going out, or it can allow things in or allow things out. And this concept ties into the two witnesses that we learn about in this week's Parashat. Now, there's a concept which is the individual and the global that's key to understand when you're dealing with judgment. There's individual judgment that was put upon people, and then there was judgment upon groups of people like all Yisrael. So you always see this duality in the scriptures between the individual and Yisrael. Now, obviously, if we deal with sin, sins like where the golden calf, that's a group of individual sins that it ultimately made up and engulfed Israel as a sin, because enough people decided to create that sin and to choose that sin. Well, that the point of entry that can be defended and should be defended first, as Mashiach states, take first the beam out of your own eye so that you could see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. It starts with us. And nowadays in religion, you rarely see that. You see that people come in, they assume that they're right, they assume that they're righteous, they're the good guys, and then they quickly are ready to go out and become zealots and start finding out who out there is the liar, who out there is wrong, who out there is this and that. And by nature, that comes from a heart of feeling you yourself are justified. Because out of humility, you would not want to speak much about others unless you had to. And if you had to, you would realize at the same time you're speaking it that you're probably guilty of this so much. And the harsher you come down upon that person, crying out for justice, declaring their sin, the greater your sin can be declared, because you also have sin. And so I believe what it says when it says the same measure shall be measured back to you. So as you grow in wisdom and righteousness, it should make you softer on other people. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have judgment of what is right or wrong, but it's whether or not you zealously pursue people with a haughty attitude, like, I can't believe you believe that, and, oh, this guy, he's demon-possessed, or, oh, he's da-da-da-da-da. I hear all kinds of crazy stuff, and I think that it comes from a heart of pride and self-justification. Because with most put-downs, it's easy when you put other people down to try and get a little residual uplifting of yourself. That, oh, I'm kind of like the publican. I'm glad I'm not like that guy over there, That is not a good place to get into. So it's okay to recognize what is right and what is wrong about situations, and even to speak it. But you have to be very careful on how zealously you pursue the speck in other people's eye, because you're usually blind to your own being. So we see this concept of the individual and the global. But if the sin was dealt with at the individual level, if when you go to point out a flaw in somebody else, you reflect the mirror back to yourself and say, in how many ways have I done the same thing? And convict yourself. Because see, the great thing is if you say, oh, this guy, he's slandering somebody, then you can look at yourself and say, in how many ways have I slandered people, indirectly or directly? And how can I, if I don't like this trait in this other person, who have I done this to, and how can I eliminate that in myself? Because you may not be able to change the other person. They may go on and slander you and blah, blah, blah. But you can change the world, and you can do that. Not to quote Michael Jackson, but yes, if you look at the man in the mirror, you can make the change if you want to change the world. Because we cannot deny ourselves. We can say to ourselves, hey, look at this guy. You can say, hey, this guy's slandering me. And then I can look at myself and say, you must stop slandering people, because this is not good that this other guy is doing, and I'm doing it. Or even if I'm not, I can say to myself, do not do this to someone else as this person is doing to you. And you can learn and grow and become more righteous on the spot, because you won't argue with yourself. So the best critic of you is you. Because when other people say, oh, hey, you're not speaking right, or you're slandering, you may defend that. But if you tell yourself that, you can bypass all your defenses and get straight to the inner man and have an impact and make a change. You can't change other people unless they choose to be changed by themselves. But you do have that access for change in yourself. So you should always be as hard, if not harder, on yourself than you are on anybody else. And that is a great key to humility and personal growth in the scriptures and in life. So we get this concept of the individual and the global. What goes out, what's in. With the gate concept, it's what's on the outside, what's on the inside. And if you're going to guard a gate, you have to, as you see with Israel, there's a pattern where wickedness in Israel is cast out, and the gates are guarded against wickedness coming in. So that's a pattern you can see all through the scriptures and with Israel. So this gate is relevant, and I had somebody earlier ask me about what I thought about the watchman concept, and I think that the watchman first starts with yourself. What good is a dead man to other people? If you allow all sin to enter into yourself, then who can hear your cry? What good is your cry if your city is spoiled, and yet you're worrying about other people's cities? So if you're going to be a watchman, rarely do I see people saying, hey, yeah, I see a lot of people saying, well, I'm criticizing this guy because I'm the watchman on the wall, we've got to warn this person, cast out this evil. But it's like, well, what about the watchman on your own wall? I rarely see people saying, I am the zealous watchman for my own sin. Oh, I bet I'm lying right now. Oh, I bet that theology I just spoke wasn't quite right. Let me point out the ways where it doesn't work. Oh, this, everybody's so quick to jump on everybody else, except for themselves. And that's unjust judgment. The judges, we're supposed to judge what comes in and what goes out. And you can't, it does you no good to keep the enemies out. If the enemies are already inside and all the wickedness is already happening inside, then what's the point of trying to keep some evil from coming in if the evil is already in? See, the fact is evil is inside and it's outside. It's inside us along with sin, and it's outside with other people's sin and influence. So we have a double duty with the gate, is to cast out what's bad and to keep what's bad from coming in. Just like our bodies do, right? There's lots of gates. It says, what are gates? Gates are our eyes, our mouth, our nose. Things come in, things go out. Our mouth, things come in, things go out. Even our bodies are when we go to the bathroom, our bodies have taken in some food. It takes out what's good, right? It keeps what's good inside, and it casts out, it purges out the bad stuff out of our bodies. And people get sick when their bodies don't function right. They're not casting out something bad that's inside is festering. See, a lot of this cancer that people are getting, all this and stuff, that's when things are inside that aren't supposed to be. There's a balance. There's something wrong inside our bodies. And it's the same way with Yisro. And what good is the guy who's dying of cancer to try and just warn other people, hey, be careful of what you eat, be careful of what you put in your body, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, he himself is fully polluted and polluting himself. The first thing is to stop polluting yourself so that you can be healthier to go and help those people who are sick. Mashiach was a great helper to people who are sick because he was cleansed. Because he didn't have sin, he could help people with their sin problem. And I think people overlook that concept far too often. And this he even says when he says, cleanse what's in your eye first. So he's telling you the same thing he did for himself, which is he was pure, just like we see the pattern with the priests. The priests, when they went to go accept the sin offering from you, first presented the sin offering for themselves, to cleanse themselves, so that they could be clean to accept your sin offering. And again, in religion, most people just simply bypass that, and they want to go quickly to seeing the sins of others and accepting and demanding their sacrifice, and yet they never presented one for themselves. So, what are our gates then? Our gates, like we talked about, are everything. It could be your eyes, your ears, your mouth, what you say, what you eat. It could be your family. Do you guard your wife from other people who might harm her? Do you guard your family and your kids from what they might see on TV, what someone might introduce to them? Do you guard the gates of your house? I remember one time I asked a person not to bring a video game in. He brought his game system over to our house, and he had some games that had some kind of magic or something in there. And I told him I didn't want that in my house. And, it was a little awkward. He's a friend of ours and all this and that. But I'm in charge of my house and the gates and what I allow in my house. Just like TV, that is a very dangerous tunnel into your house for things that are not right and things that are not righteous. So you have to be careful of that too. But we're supposed to guard the gates and what comes into our house and what can defile us. So we have our individual, then we have our family, then we have our house, then we have our congregation, then we have our city, then we have, Messianics or whatever. We have certain responsibilities at every level. But it all starts with the seed, which is yourself. And we're going to see that there's an interesting thing here. Why is it that next part it goes into the just judges, but notice we also get the laws for the king here. Why? Because again, it all flows from the king, who's the authority. The king has the authority of the nation. So from him flows out the laws, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, all of these things. He's the focal point that it comes out of. And in the same way, that's a model of us. We're our individual king. The king is like your head. It is the authority over your body. And what that king says, finds acceptable and all of that, flows out to our body. So if in my mind I find it okay to do something on the Sabbath that I'm not supposed to, then it directs my body and allows the members of my body to also be disobedient. And if I say that I will not eat that unkosher thing, then my hand will not reach for it. My mouth will not open to it. My teeth will not chew it, and I will not swallow it, because they follow the authority of my mind. So my mind in this situation is the king of my body. And my mind and my body is the king of my household. So I determine what my wife will eat. If I don't like something that she might have purchased at the store, then I will say, we aren't going to eat that. I have that authority over my kids. And those are the ones I really have authority over. I have authority over myself, and then my wife, and then my children. Beyond that, my authority starts to diminish quite a bit. But it doesn't mean that we can't go to brotherly love, or we don't have some kind of authority at that point. But the key is to start. The number one place it has to start is with myself. So before I try and change man, before I try and do all this, I have to have just judges in my gates. And it all flows out from there. That's why Torah study is so important. And what does it mean to have just judges? Well, judges were supposed to be men of truth, right? How can you be a man of truth if you don't study truth? If you don't challenge your own beliefs, if you don't challenge other people's beliefs, if you don't focus more on Torah. Well, judges, when they were originally established, have three qualities. Number one, they had to be men of truth. And in order to know the truth, you got to study your Torah. And you have to challenge your own beliefs, and you have to refine it and pound it and challenge it to whittle away the lies and the misunderstandings. Number two, they had to be men who would not take a bribe. And a bribery ultimately is something that affects your judgment. So if you're going to be a judge, you can't be altered or swayed by things. That includes being a respecter of persons. If a man was a king or your friend, you can't alter your judgment for them. It also means that you can't alter it for your own gain, which is you can't say, well, because this will impact or because I believe a certain way. You have to always observe the facts, unbiased, and make your judgment call based on the laws of Torah, which set the standard. They're the just weights and measures of God. So you got to constantly try and refine your weights and measures and get closer to the weights and measures of the Torah. So you have to study it very well, like any lawyer who was going to discuss matters of law. They have to know the law in and out in order to really be able to understand how different things would be defined with that. So, and then you have it's men who hate coveting. And coveting is it's the unjust gain. A lot of people, if you look up the word coveting all the way through the entire Bible and let the Bible define it, you get a little different definition than what a lot of people just think, oh, what is coveting? I don't know. I guess it means just really wanting something. That's not exactly the biblical definition of coveting. The most standard used contextual definition of coveting is it's tied to unjust gain, but in particular, most uses of that word are tied to examples where people killed somebody to take their stuff. They harmed somebody to take their things. So it's the shedding of blood for personal gain. So coveting a person, it doesn't mean you can't want something, that it's not okay to want a nicer pair of shoes. That's not coveting. But if you were going to rob a man, beat him over the head and take his shoes, that would be coveting. And, you can't, it's unjust gain, and usually it implies some hurt or harm to the other party in order to take something, directly or indirect harm in order to gain something. So this concept of the judge and the coveting and the bribes, they're all very similar in what it is it's altering your judgment for your personal gain. In the concept of coveting, it's your personal gain, that you've taken something, you've desired something unjustly, that was unjust. If you're desiring another man's wife, it's an unjust desire, because in order to attain it would not only violate the Torah, but it would cause harm to him, cause harm to your family, to his family, all of this and that, to satisfy your own desires. So when it talks about just judges, these are men of truth who hate coveting, who won't take a bribe. These are the traits of just judges, and this is what we're supposed to have in all of our gates. So we aren't supposed to be a respecter of persons. We are supposed to evaluate our own statements as with the same vigor that we would evaluate somebody else's statements, our friends' statements as well as our enemies' statements. We are supposed to judge all of these matters, actions, all of that, and have judgment in all of our gates and what we bring in. When we take out, what happens with most people is they go, oh, it's my friend. Oh, come on in. Skip past the judgment part. You're my buddy. I can trust you. I'll just let you in. And they didn't stop and say, wait a minute, my buddy, just as we learned in last week's Parasha, if your buddy comes and tells you to go worship another god, then you're to be the first to put your hand to his throat, or to deliver him to the judges, actually, and you'll be the first one when the death sentence is carried out. That is, you're not to hide him, it says, and even though he's your friend, because see, what you did is, if you follow that back, you've been an unjust judge, and you've been an unjust judge in your gate. You allowed your friend's sin to have less weight than your enemy's sin. And the fact is sin is sin. Truth is truth, and lies are lies. Your lies are just as much lies as the person you're arguing with, who you think their theories are ridiculous. You can't give yourself extra credit and not point out the flaws in your own theories, but be willing to point out the flaws in other theories. This is an area where we all have to grow. We have to have just judges in our gates, in all of our gates. Personally, it goes from the individual out to globally, individual to the family, to the house, to others, and beyond. So then we go to this concept. So we've looked at what the gates could be. Then we've looked at just judgment, means not altering your standard of measure to benefit yourself or others or any other thing, to learn the just measurements. And then we see the next part of this parashat talks about the king. And this goes, again, the reverse of the individual to roles. So now we see that we do it with an individual, but as an individual, I have authority then. See, when I adjust my individual judgment, and I guard my own gates against my own lies and deception, against my own bad theories and all this and that, when I do all of that, it spreads out to all those then that I impact. So if I do a good job Torah studying, and I do more diligent search and find out, oh, I was a little bit wrong on that understanding, and get it a little bit better, then when I teach my wife and kids, it goes out and flows out, just like anything that the king believes. He was to write a copy of the Torah and read from it every day. See, so his Torah knowledge will impact his judgment, because his judgment impacts others. And so we are the king of ourselves, and we need to get our authority, right, our mind, in alignment with the greater authority, which is the Torah, God, so that that Torah becomes our authority and God become one, because the Torah rules over us. And when we do that, it'll also rule over our households and our family. So, as it says, judgment starts at my house. That's what the scriptures say. So, we look at Deuteronomy 17:2. It says, if there be found among you within any of your gates, which what YHWH your Elohim gives you, man or woman that has wrought wickedness in the sight of YHWH your Elohim in transgressing his covenant. This first part of this verse is key, because when you look at what it means on an individual and a spiritual level, it's also the same as saying that within your gates, if there's anybody that's violating the Torah, so if there's a sin within us, within our mouths, within our eyes and what we look at, within our hearts, that it's our job to have that judgment and to search those out and to say everybody wants to root out the liars and the false prophets out there, right? I mean, how many people on Facebook and all that, they're so quick there's so many ministries that the foundation of the ministry isn't to spread the truth and the Torah. It's to root out the false prophets, as if they themselves were not false prophets also, both to others and to themselves, because they're not completely true to the Torah. They need to study the Torah more and stop being a false prophet. See, a false prophet, we are false prophets to ourselves when we allow ourselves to believe things without testing them. Then we've told ourselves a lie and we've believed it. We've accepted the false prophet. So we have that. I just don't see the zealousness for the individual saying, "Oh, I'm going to rid myself as a false prophet. I'm going to rid all of the things. I'm going to go back and double check everything that I believe to make sure things that I'm telling myself aren't false prophecies, false things that aren't really true." See, I just don't see that heart very much out there, and that's what you should see if you're talking to somebody who really studies the Word of God. You're going to find that type of humility where, it's like, they look, I don't know how many times I've went to say something to somebody else and either said it or didn't say it, but felt 10 times worse about my own self. And instantly I was convicted of how many ways I must have done that same sin and be so guilty. And again, I take that not as a negative, but I say, okay, this is a chance for me to rid this thing that I see wrong with somebody else in myself, because I know I've been guilty of it. And I'm not ready to hit them over the head with a 2x4 because of their flaw, because I know that, oh my, how can I stand before God knowing I've done this so much greater? And that humbles you. So judgment starts at my house. Now, next in this week's Parashat, we get this concept of the two witnesses. And the two witnesses are interesting because the two witnesses, there's a lot of ways to address the two witnesses. But what we see in ourselves is just like our own eyes. We have two eyes, right? It's interesting. 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and then 2 hands. We have a lot of things that are double. If you look at our body, split down the middle, it's a right and left hand side. And those are like 2 witnesses of one thing. And how many of us see multiple witnesses of our own sins? Our mind is supposed to, right? The judges at the gates, they're supposed to have, 2 witnesses when they're making judgment about any lawlessness. So how many times have we, in our own personal gates, judged ourselves and seen with 2 witnesses where we've done something wrong, and then cast out that thing and punish that thing in ourselves? One example is the word and deed act like 2 witnesses also. So there's a difference from your thoughts and your actions, because the thoughts was the first witness of it. You could have a wicked thought. But if you act upon it, that's a second witness that verifies the first witness and makes it an established matter. So it's one thing to think of stealing something, and that's bad. But it's not enough to accuse you, or convict you, I should say. It's enough to maybe to accuse you, but it's not enough to convict you of that crime of theft. But when you then not only thought it, but then did it, you've established it, and now you're guilty. So the first goal is to stop the sins that you're doing outwardly. We talked about the outward and the inward. The second goal is, once you get beyond outwardly sinning, like Mashiach teaches, the higher level of stuff. Like, now you're not sleeping with another man's wife, that's good. But if you look on a woman with lust, you're guilty. You see, now we've taken it to the inside. Now we're going to go and try and make sure that there's not even one witness against you. That it isn't that you actually thought about it and then did it. But now you're not doing it, but you shouldn't even think it. And that is a much more difficult, I know I can speak personally, when you get past the level of doing the outward sins, of not keeping the Sabbath and all these kind of things. Then it goes to trying to stop yourself from even having the wrong type of thoughts. And that is a much more difficult thing. And but it's a higher level, and I think it's a better level. And if you, again, stop it at its core, which is the thought, it should never get to that point. You know, like Mashiach said, if the inside of the cup is clean, then the outside shall be clean. So if you haven't even had the thought of lusting after a woman, then obviously you're not going to have the action either. So you start by at least stopping the outward things. But then you work on the inside things, getting that spirit of the law. And when you get that spirit of the law, it'll flow out and it'll stop all expressions of that violation of the law. So in this parashat, we also learn about seeking counsel. So when it says you judge the small matters, and then you're going to take the bigger matters to Moshe, right, or to the Levi'im. Same model in Parashat Yitro as we have in Parashat Shoftim about the judges in both situations. We have the setting up of the just judges, and then we have you deal with certain issues, and if it gets to be a bigger issue, you can take it to a higher court, so to speak. Well, this is about seeking counsel on difficult things, judgment calls. If it's too difficult for you, go seek counsel. How many times this can be applied to Torah study? Do people get into a conversation where someone hits them with a zinger about their theology, and they feel like they have to respond, even though they might not have a good answer for it? You know, sometimes I've wanted to turn around and respond, but first I go back and study. I seek the counsel of the Torah, and go back and study and come back and say, okay, wait a minute. Let me go seek the counsel, and then come back and maybe you're right. Before I'm so quick to say you're wrong, how do I know you're wrong? I have to go to the Torah and weigh both sides. So seeking counsel is important. As Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkens unto counsel is wise. So you should listen to others. If you're only going off what you already believe, and that includes in the heat of an argument where you just want to go back and say, no, I disagree. But maybe they brought up a good point that you need to go research. And most people, they act like a broken record. You make a good point, and it causes them to pause for a second, but then they just skip back and start repeating the previous things that they said because they don't know how to overcome that issue. Well, a better thing to do is we say, you know what, you bring up a good point, even though I don't necessarily know if it's right, and I still disagree with you, I'm going to research that. You know, and find the answer and come back and let you know what I think about that. If you don't have the answer already, go search it out. Go seek counsel. So the last point in this week's parasha is the talking of a prophet like Moshe. And I believe that is a model of talking about these gates. Again, it's that there's an inside and there's an outside, right? So it's saying, I will have judgment, right? That judge, that prophet, because a prophet warns and communicates and transmits the word of God. And so this prophet needs to be both on the inside and the outside of Israel, right? I mean, what we do, we have outward righteousness and we have inward righteousness. And we have outward warnings to others and we have our inward warnings to ourselves. We must judge ourselves in our own house also. So this prophet like Moshe, in the New Testament, talks about Moshe being like the letter of the law and Mashiach being the spirit of the law. So here we have the letter, the physical, the outward, and then we have the inward, the spiritual. So we have an outside of the gate and inside of the gate again. So when it talks about a prophet like Moshe, who was a guard of the gate, a guard of truth, a guard of Israel, then we see that there's going to be another prophet like him. And who was that? I think that he was inseparable, like the story of Shlomo, right? You can't cut the baby in half. Moshe and Mashiach, I think, are like that. The letter of the law and the spirit of the law can't be divided. If they're divided, they die. You see? Because even though, in a way, they can be separate, but they can't be removed from each other entirely. There's a connection, because what happens is, even though Moshe, the letter of the law, can go away, not to get into a big Paul concept, but the spirit of something includes the letter. The spirit of something is actually greater. It includes all expressions. So if somebody said, hey, that guy slept with that person's wife, that's adultery. That's the letter of the law. The spirit of the law is that he shouldn't even look on a woman with lust. A married woman with lust. The difference in those two is that would include writing a love letter to a married woman, holding her hand, kissing her, making out with her. All of those things are included in the spirit. See, because once you have the spirit, it includes all those expressions. Actually, physically going and sleeping with her is only one expression. So the letter is actually much smaller than the spirit. And in the same way, Yochanan said, I must decrease so that he can increase. Yochanan was a model of Moshe and a model of the letter of the law, in that he was the warning to repent. The first thing that we learn is the basics. Like, don't sleep with another man's wife. But then Mashiach comes later and says, now I'm going to teach you the higher level, which is, don't look on a woman with lust. And now you start to contemplate that and you go, gosh, if my spirit was right, it wouldn't lead to sleeping with a woman. It wouldn't lead to me rubbing her shoulders. It wouldn't lead to our first kiss. It wouldn't lead to any of those things that lead ultimately to this sin. So it goes in and in closer to the seed. And the truth is in the spirit of the commandment. That is the ultimate truth. What's been given to us is just some examples in the Torah, but it doesn't cover all things. So judgment, righteous judgment, is when we look at what we have in the Torah, the literal examples, we use those like precedences. And those give us examples, but there's things that weren't spoken of in the Torah. And we have to use all of the Torah to try and get to what's the spirit of the law? The more you know the spirit of the law, the more you can apply it to things that were never spoken of in Torah. And in the beginning, you might just have to use the Torah just to avoid the basic sins. But as you advance, you should be able to learn the spirit of the Torah, and that's what I believe Yahushua did. So when he talks about a prophet like Moshe, I believe it is referring to Yahushua, who was the other side of the door, the inside side of the door. Moshe worked on the outside. Yahushua worked on the inside. And in this way, we have to become our own prophets, right? We must first stop the outward sin, the Moshe, to discern by studying the Torah what is the outward sin. And then we must take it inside and defend the inside and make sure that we're not allowing ourselves sin inside. So a diligent watchman watches the inside of themselves, the outside, what's going on in here. Is there an enemy in the gates? Is there an enemy outside of the gates? This is what we're supposed to do. So we have to learn to become our own prophet. We need to cast out our own false prophecies and become our own watchmen, watching the inside and the outside of our own gates. And when we do this, we naturally are anything we are a part of, anything we have authority over or inclusion and fellowship in will be benefited because we directly changed and become more righteous. I mean, there's absolutely no shorter point from A to B than casting out our own wickedness. You want to cast out other people's wickedness, point out their flaws, see all this and that. You could spend all your time doing that, but you've neglected yourself. And there's a greater, see, you could sit there and say, hey, this guy's lying, this guy's doing all this all day long. But the fact is, it's actually unlikely that person's going to change. Your percentages are so low that that person who was being wicked is going to turn around and say, oh, you're right. Whereas if you spent that same time finding somewhere that you lied and making that right and stopping that from happening again, you could have instant result. Your percentages, you can't block yourself once you decide to make a change. The other person can block you, and no matter how perfect you spoke it, no matter how many scriptures you gave them, they can say, no, I don't want to hear it, and ignore you. But you have 100% chance of success with yourself. So from a logical standpoint, all the time you spend pointing out everybody else's flaws would be much better invested in pointing out your own flaws. And it actually would be better. Some people say, oh, but it's for the body. It would be better for the body of Mashiach if you spent that time investing on making yourself more righteous. Because you could guarantee the result was going to be a change. For an hour put in scriptures and challenging yourself and your own beliefs, you're guaranteed to come out and accept that and make the change. And then you are part of the body of Mashiach. So therefore the body of Mashiach got stronger and more righteous and sin was cast out. But when you try and go do that to others who you have no authority over, the chances of return are very minimal. So guarding the gates. This is what I call making a city of peace. Jerusalem is called the city of peace. And how you make a city of peace is we have all of these members. We have all of these gates. We have all this wickedness that can come in us and out of us. And when we guard those gates, we then can have peace with YHWH. And when we have peace and do that, when we take that beam out of our eye, we can see the speck in our other brother's eye and offer and try and help that person as best we can. But if everybody took care of themselves, we wouldn't need to do a lot of that pointing of the fingers at other people. So that's my message for 2005-6 called Guard the Gates. It is understanding what gates are, what just judgment is, what's coming and going, the authority, dealing with the authority first, which is us. We have the greatest authority over ourselves, and working our way down. Then you work with your wife, who has authority over the kids. Then you work with the kids who are under your authority, and will spread that authority out to the world even when you die. And then, after all of that, after you, your wife, and your family are in line, time much better invested, then go out to fellowship and worry about what this other guy who has nothing, who you have no authority over, is doing. And if everybody took care of their own, the whole nation of Israel would be much better off. So until next time, I will say shalom and guard your gates.